Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second of two of our summer fellows talks for 2025. My name is Charmaine Nelson. I'm the Provost Professor of Art History here at UMass Amherst in Amherst, Massachusetts. I'm also the founding director of Slavery North, which is a research hub that welcomes students from undergrad honors, MA, PhD, artists in residence, and also visiting professors who do their own independent research on Canadian slavery and slavery in the US North. If you know anything about the study of transatlantic slavery, those are vastly understudied regions, and that's why we are here. So today I'd like to introduce one of our artist in residence fellows for summer 2025, Letitia Fraser. First, I'm going to introduce her, and then Letitia will be speaking for about 40 minutes, followed by about 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers. If anyone has a question, you can unmute and unmic at that point and ask it directly, or you can type it into the chat. And the wonderful Emily Davidson, who's our Director of Research and Engagement, will be happy to read your question to Letitia. So Letitia Fraser is an interdisciplinary artist whose work centers her experiences as an African Nova Scotian woman growing up in the province's Black communities of North Preston and Beachville. Descending from a long line of artists, her creative instincts were nurtured early in life. Through a combination of painting and textile, she unearths previously untold narratives and pays homage to her community's history of quilting. She is a recipient of numerous awards, including the 2018 Nova Scotia Talent Trust RBC Emerging Artist Award, and was longlisted for the 2022 Sobeys Art Award. And if people don't understand what the Sobeys Art Award is, it's one of the most renowned Canadian art awards. Her work is included in several private and public collections, including the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia, Scotiabank, the Canada Council, and the Wedge Collection. So I'll hand it over to you now, Letitia.
Okay. So I will get right into it. Go over. Hopefully everyone can hear me well. There. Okay. So why herbalism? I first felt it is very important to preserve history. Being an African Nova Scotian, so this was one of the main motivations. A lot of my work is about preservation of my culture and my history as well. It's also about finding the connection to my ancestral roots. There is very little that I in fact know, so this was a great opportunity for me to learn more. Community herbalism. I felt like it was a really great way to encourage community. I feel like people, for the most part nowadays, are very individualistic. And so we're kind of losing, in my opinion, we're kind of losing the opportunity to build community. The practice of gathering herbs and all that stuff that's done together is really important for community. Gathering the knowledge from the elders. We're losing a lot of elders in our community that have that knowledge. So if I think this is just like a great way to learn more and engage with my community. Self-sufficiency. So during the 2010s, I was pretty sick. And I had the doctors couldn't really find anything wrong with me. I would get blood tests and come back fine. But I was still very weak, didn't really understand what was going on. So during the pandemic, I saw a nutritionist as well as took some herbal courses. And then things started to shift drastically for me. Please don't get it twisted. I will, go to the doctor and get some medicine if need be. But this kind of led me down a rabbit hole of studying herbal medicine. And then that led me to wonder specifically what my ancestors would have been studying and how they would have taken care of themselves. So briefly, I'm going to jump into traditional African systems of medicine. When I first came here, this was where a lot of my research was, but it's kind of getting, I don't want to spend too much time on it in this, um, for this presentation. Okay. So there are three parts that make up the African Indigenous system of medicine. The first being the medical substance. This can contain plants, soil, insects, and animal parts. The second being the spiritual forces, the gods or God. The third being the human spirit, which would include the healer and the patient. There is a belief that the human being cannot be separate from nature. It's the healer's job to guarantee a balanced relationship between their patient and the natural world. So who are the healers? So the herbalist deals mainly with herbs, bark, roots. After careful diagnosis, they would prescribe a regimen of drugs. So the diviner slash seer, their job is to perform rituals and to use tools that can vary from one community to another. This is very generalized. But yeah, so it's a seer's job to describe the origin of the illness, items used for divination, and were often kept, in goat skin bag. So this is just an example of one. This was a medicine bag from Congo in the 1800s in West Africa. So the midwife. The midwife was a prominent job in the African ethnomedicine. Often having a birth attendant, the midwife's job is to care for the pregnant woman. Herbs were often used by the midwife to correct the exposition, encourage growth, as well as checking for pregnancies, like if the woman was pregnant or not. So from here, we move into the plantation. So this was a book that I found called Plantation Life Before Emancipation by Reverend R.Q. Millard. So often plantation owners would take it upon themselves to heal the enslaved. This book is a compilation of written letters by the Reverend, who was a Presbyterian minister from New Orleans. This passage of the book not only downplays the potential harm of the enslaved, but also romanticizes it. He speaks of the enslaved like they're children and preventing them from healing themselves. He states, in each plantation library was a book of medicine. My father's, I remember, was Ewell's practice. Books written without technical phrases, clearly describing in the language of common people diseases and their remedies. As the maladies of the African with his simple civilization were rarely obscure, many planters acquired a very considerable skill in diagnosing and in prescribing, and probably killed no more of their patients than a young MD graduate is said to kill. Just in getting his hands in, a big jug of castor oil was always on hand and had to be kept under lock and key. So fond was the darky of dosing himself for any of the ailments with that antiquated and heroic remedy. This reinforces the paternalistic myth that slave holders provided sufficient care, while also dismissing Black self-care. So interviews with former slaves was the best source of information for me because it was very difficult to find pretty much anything. Susan Merritt mentions having two doctors tend to them on the plantation and the use of asafoetida. I'm pronouncing that correctly. It was thought to have it was thought that the smell would rid them of illness and prevent respiratory issues. This was a very common practice. Morrison Davison. Morrison Davison mentioned the plantation owner's desire to heal them quickly, with Davison expressing the cost of them dying, comparing themselves to a mule. Morris also speaks to the enslavers' distaste for home remedy practices. The enslavers' wives often use herbs to heal their captives. Dora Franks mentions the use of snake root and her desire to continue using it. This was after a large amount of them, as children, suddenly became ill. Prince Johnson speaks about, Prince Johnson speaks about voodoo, how voodoo is forbidden. He says, Old Miss wouldn't stand for no such things as voodoo and haunts. When she inspects us once a week, you better not have no charms around your neck, neither. She wouldn't even allow us to wear a bag of Moderator. Most folks believe that would keep off the sickness. She called such that superstition. She said us enlightened Christians, Presbyterians. In the 1700s, a law was passed to prevent slaves from using medicinal herbs unless approved by their enslaver. This was also to prevent the enslaved from using herbs to poison the plantation owners, as well as preventing Black women from using herbs to eliminate unwanted pregnancies. Very shortly after the law was signed. So the Bailey Family Plantation account book was one that I found. This is in Virginia, unfortunately. Didn't find much more, but the account book itself had many things kind of stricken from it. So, but the pages that were very clear were herbal remedies. So this this speaks of snake root as in addition to, and then like how to make it and everything. I'm assuming that this was because the handwriting was very different from the rest of the account book, so I'm assuming that this was from a doctor that would come in. Yeah, there was another recipe for your flux. I think it's either flux or the blue. It's a little X in the top there, so I'm assuming flux. But yeah, just gives a bit of a recipe of what could be done for instance this patient. This was also the accounts of which doctors would come in and who they would heal and how much it would cost. Zebediah was the owner. Zechariah was the owner. So resources of the southern fields and forests. So this was published in 1863. This was a book written by Francis Pierre Porcher, who is a trained physician and botanist. Porcher was commissioned during the American Civil War. It was intended as a practical guide to help Confederate physicians and civilians identify local plants that could be used for medicine and food during the Union blockade, which cut off access to imported foods. So he mentions a few herbs. So button snake root, negroes in the southern states were said to be very partial to this plant and valued it as a febrifuge and tonic. They make an infusion of it and drink it freely for chills and fever. He also mentions that this was also used by groups of Native Americans. A smooth alder, this was blood purifier that was used. Tulip tree, the Negroes as well as the Indians esteem the bark of this tree highly. They use it in decoctions for colds and to produce respiration. Virginia snake roots. The Negro in the lower parts of the state makes such use of it, this plant, excuse me, for snake bites and other poisons. They chew the roots and apply it to the wound. Although there is a paternalistic tone, the author drew from many different sources for his research, including his own, which was enslaved Africans, Native Americans, and again, so. So this kind of leads me to the African American healers. So again, we have the herbalists using their knowledge from their African roots. Many plantations had Black herbalists who would tend to each other. The conjurer and the root doctor. These were individuals who practiced in African American hoodoo, which is a practice, spiritual practice, excuse me, rooted in Christianity. Hoodoo's medicinal practice is also derived from African and Native American herbal knowledges, and I think also some European folk medicine. Yes, so the granny on the plantation, grannies would often become the doctors. They were also assisted with childbirth and provide medicinal care with herbal remedies. Okay, so again, slave narratives being the most common, most resourceful, I would say, a resource for me. So Thomas Foote from Maryland, excuse me. The other ones that I mentioned were down south. So Thomas Foote shares a story of his mother, who was trained by a homeopathic doctor in Baltimore County. The doctor's wife also taught his mother how to read and write. With this knowledge, she learned how to heal people with herbs and roots. Thomas's mother also served as a midwife and assisted with the births of the, as Thomas mentions, the poor white slaves and free Negroes. So he mentions, since mother told me, and I have heard her tell others hundreds of times, the one time a slave of Old Man Cockney was seen coming from her home early in the morning. He had been there for treatment of an ailment which Dr. Esnor, which was the physician who trained her, had failed to cure. After being treated by my mother for a time, he got well. When the slave was searched, he had in his possession a small bag in which a stone of a particular shape and several roots were found. He said that mother had given it to him, and it had the power to, excuse me, and it had the power over all with whom it came in contact. Thomas's mother was later accused of voodooism and was jailed over this. Once she was released, she was told to leave Baltimore County or she would be sold into slavery. Thomas's mother moved to York, Pennsylvania, where she lived until 1865, later returning in 1867. Another example was formerly enslaved man named Richard Max was born in Southern Maryland and lived with his mother, father, and sister on the McPherson's farm. He says when the slaves took sick or became, when the slaves took sick or some woman gave birth to a child, herbs, salves, and liniments were used or a midwife or old mama was the attendant. Unless severe sickness, Miss McPherson was sent for a white doctor. That was very seldom. So the Harlem, so this was very similar to the slave narratives and forces of slavery, except that this was done a bit different. So Vivian Morrison, I was an interviewer and a writer for the folklore unit, the folklore unit of the New York City Federal Writers Project. So she set out to interview two men who earned a living selling herbs. Lenox Avenue would be well populated with spiritualists whose sidelines would be peddling of herbs, would be peddling of herbs and the brewing of weird, seething voodoo concoctions that were veiled in mystery, a heritage from the jungles of Africa and the hot tropical climates of Haiti and West Indies. Even now, I am almost convinced that no matter what your ailment, there is a herb somewhere, possibly in Harlem, to cure it. My conjurman insists on it. So she meets with the West Indian man, only known by the name of Sagua. He gives her several remedies and rituals and practices before sending on her way. He says, your kidneys bother you, don't let them. Boil a couple teaspoons of cream of tartar and flaxseed in a pint of water and drink it. You'll feel like a different person. She interviews another man by the name of Jupiter Man, who's known as Jupiter Man, William Weiner, he was a registered pharmacist who owned a root and herb store. He says, most white people don't know how much they depend on herbs. There have been a widely advertised cough medicine on the market in recent years. For example, it's a good medicine, but what's in it? But what's it made from? Extracted thyme. Before most people ever heard of it, the people of Harlem would buy 10 cents worth of thyme, making a brew when they had a bad cough. People around Harlem who know about herbs could tell you to get some dandelion root, rhubarb, sacred bark, and a little mayapple root and make your own. 10 to 1, if you took this homemade remedy, you'd feel much better. All right. So wanted to bring this all back to Nova Scotia. I wanted to give just like a quick overview of who I am and my work. And again, a little bit of history. I'll go through this very quickly. So in the 1600s, there was an interpreter who came, I think during this time there would be enslaved individuals in Nova Scotia as well. But Matthew de Costa was very well documented as a translator during the fur trade. 1782 to 85, Black loyalists arrived during the American Revolutionary War. And they were given land that was terrible. The conditions were awful as well. So they eventually, out of the 3,000 that came, 1,000 of them went to Sierra Leone in 1792. So in 1796, the Jamaican Maroons arrived. And I think there were 600, around 600, 500 down there. They met with the same conditions as the Black Loyalists and left in the 1800s. Sort of in the year. And then during 1813, 15, arrived Black refugees. This is, I just want to reiterate, this is a painting. This is by an artist, Richard Rudnick. And then there were the late arrivals, Caribbeans who went to Cape Breton, my collection. So I found just like a newspaper clipping of when some refugees, Black refugees would have arrived. This just kind of speaks really briefly about transport of a few hundred Negroes that are alive in 1814. So this is where I would have traced some of my ancestry. So this is an archival photo of the community where my maternal side of the family is from, which is not Preston. You can see on the land, it's really, there's a lot of rocks and boulders, making it really difficult to grow vegetables, provide for yourself during that time. This road is still, obviously it looks, it's paved and everything, but like it's still there. The church at the end there's as well. Oh, and I'm from the, as mentioned in my bio, I'm from the communities of North Preston and Beach Hill, was where my roots are from. There were 52 Black communities that settled in Nova Scotia, but they're kind of shrinking to a degree. Like they started out that much, but now they're kind of it's like in the 20s. So my artwork is, the themes of my work mostly are around the African Nova Scotian experience, and I paint portraiture for some of the African Nova Scotian historical figures. So staying kind of within the context of the work that I'll be continuing doing, the painting of the young man is my husband. I often paint African Nova Scotians. This was for a show that was dealing with superstitions, which after doing more research, it traced it back to African American hoodoo. And then the older lady is, this was a commission for the Delmore Buddy Day Learning Institute. It was for a book cover for the Grandmother's Day by Earl Pearson, I think her name was. So she, just in the book of documents, her time, what Nova Scotia would have looked like in her time, which was a really rewarding experience. And I'm very honored to have been a part of that. Just to give you an idea of how I make my work, I guess. So I take a lot of my inspiration from how resourceful my grandmother was while she was making her quilts. This is her with one of my cousins while she was making quilts. So I take inspiration from, again, her resourcefulness, and I put the quilts in the background, sew quilts, stretch it onto the back of my work. And again, these are relatives of mine. So this is my great aunt. It's a portrait I did of her 2019. And She helped my mother raise me, so I was with her quite a bit. She's probably the one that I would have had the most connection with when it came to superstitions and a lot of those things. She also was very resourceful. She would take me to like a park and we would go pick blueberries. She would also, you know, gather herbs from the garden and, you know, just have make supper. I didn't know any difference and I enjoyed it. So yeah, this is just a painting of my grandmother. She often had her remedies as well. Bitter tea was one that she used often, which I only tasted once, and it was pretty gross. My mother likes to mention that people would often confuse it for apple juice in the fridge. But yeah, I guess from here, this is pretty much the end. From here, I want to continue my research on potentially the sea trade. I also have on my father's side of the family, there's some of my ancestries to the Caribbean, so I would love to learn more that area, types of herbalism. Um, yeah, that's what it is. The plan is ultimately to incorporate everything that I've learned and to have a series of paintings that highlight the individuals that I have shown through the work here, like the healers, the many different types of healers. I'm back home and then do interviews with Nova Scotians. That'll be the next article. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Letitia. All right, so I'm just going to jump in here with the first question, and just to let you know, you're dead right. That's an X, and that is flux. And
Yep.
flux was, just so everybody's on the same page here. Flux was known also at the time as, or what we call today, dysentery, which was, hate to be gross, but it was characterized by bloody diarrhea. And this is what one of the things that many of our ancestors were dying of during the Middle Passage on the slave ships. So you're absolutely right. That's an X. The other thing, Letitia, just to get everybody, who many people probably listening have never been to Nova Scotia. So to understand where Preston is on the Dartmouth side of Bedford Basin. And think about the fact that the British strategically put the Black loyalists and other Black people on that side so that it was difficult for them to get to Halifax, where many of the British were settled. So today it's an easy ferry ride, or you go in your car across the bridge. But at the time, you'd have to travel around the basin, which is, for the good Canadians in the house, 25 to 30 kilometers around the basin, which is 15 to 20 miles. And we're talking about a group of people who were impoverished, so they didn't necessarily have horses, right? So how do you even get to the other side when you need to get to the other side, which is where, in many cases, the wealth was in terms of where the white settlers was, or white settlers, sorry, were. Letitia, at the top, when you started with that goatskin medicine bag, Congolese, it just struck me how the object itself is combining spiritual, aesthetic, and medicinal purposes, and that it's beautiful. It's a beautiful object. So, can you talk to us about if you found out about anything about why goatskin as opposed to some other material, and talk to us about the aesthetic components of the practices of medicine that you may have come across?
Yeah, I didn't really find much more on why goat skin. I'm assuming just that's what was available. That was readily available at the time. Easily to, easy to put together. Um, yeah, listen, that's
But they seem to me too to be precious objects because someone had to take time to adorn it. Like, who
yeah.
takes time to just write? It's a medicine bag, but it's also something else. There's another power in it, which I think is really poetic, given what you're now doing with that, with those histories. So thank you for that. If there's anybody who wants to type something in the chat, please go ahead. David has a hand.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Um, Such a fascinating project, Letitia, and really awesome to see your amazing paintings too. I thought it's just, yeah, so amazing how you're pointing out all this knowledge among enslaved people, medical knowledge, healing knowledge. And what struck me was when you mentioned that there was one person who was threatened with jail for practicing voodoo or something like that. And I mean, I just don't know anything about that, and it made me wonder, were there laws specifically banning the practice of quote unquote voodoo, whatever that meant? And because it speaks to how much of this knowledge would have been systematically destroyed through laws like that. And I just wondered if you knew anything about, in this state, there was a law against voodoo or something like that.
Yeah, in Virginia, there was a law that was passed. That prevented them from using anything that had to do with herbalism or voodoo conjure. There were a lot of I had to kind of leave that. Like I was going in many different places and I had to kind of leave them. But yeah, uh there was a lot of points where where the enslavers were poisoning some of their enslavers. They were also using, there were points where they were using voodoo on their enslavers. And so after a while, they had to kind of ultimately shut it down. But I do think it was, more than just that. I think it was, yeah.
Thanks for that.
Emily, are there any questions in the room?
Yes.
Thank you so much. This is Jennifer DeClue asking a question. I really appreciate you walking through the history, sort of West African history, African American history, and the research that you did to find mentions of plants and herbs. And I'm personally just curious about like where you found those quotes, like and that maybe you and I could have a conversation because I'm so curious about the research that you've done. My question has to do really with your practice and because so much of what you're talking about in this project has to do with plants and your previous work as portraits of people. So I wondered if you're thinking about also doing portraits of people, or if the plants that you discover will figure into the landscape at all? Like, are you interested in landscape or the portraits of plants, or will you stick with people?
Yeah, I will stick with people. I think it's important to have African Nova Scotian figures be painted portraiture. So that's one thing I am focused on. I've thought of a landscape, but I my ultimately my plan is to incorporate the herbs into the fabric. So making prints, block prints of like the patterns of some of the herbs that were mentioned by them and like what they would have been using. So I'll just grab those, put them into pattern and have them in the background instead of like in the same way that I do with the quilts now, but instead of using used fabric, I'll use the patterns that I'm creating. Yeah, that's how those will be kind of intertwined.
Excellent. And I'm so glad you showed us some of your work. It's really beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll jump in with another one, but I'll also encourage the students in the room to feel free. And there's no question too basic because, again, the study of slavery in Canada, the U.S. North is not in the curriculum. Okay, guys? So just stew on that a bit. Letitia, back to you. I was thinking, did you come across any evidence of the enslavers seeking the African treatments of the enslaved healers? And I take it most of your evidence you were sharing with us was from the U.S. I don't know if it's South, seems to be South and maybe Mid-Atlantic, but I'm thinking about this infamous overseer in Jamaica in the 1700s, 18th century guy left, Englishman, goes to Jamaica, diaries his life, including horrific sexual predation, but also keeps track of his venereal diseases and seeks treatment from both Western doctors, which at the time, let's just point this out for everybody. Western medicine at this time around things like venereal disease was make you vomit, bleed you, and give you mercury. So
Yeah.
they were literally poisoning people to death, right? So he was at least, smart enough to say, I see these enslaved people over here doing something that actually looks healing. And he would reach out and documented when he went to them and said, I also took this cure from them. So are you seeing any of that too, where the white people, enslavers and surrogates are also saying, hey, this actually looks like it's working. Let me get in on this?
Yeah, so from what I did see, there were, I think there was in one of the narratives, there was something about there was like a storm, or there was something going on where they couldn't leave the plantation to seek medical help. The doctor could not get there. So, and the plantation owner was very ill, and so they had to use their practices on him just to try to heal him as best as they could. That was one that I remember. And then the other things the other things that I noticed were that it varied obviously from plantation to plantation. That some people, like I mentioned, prohibited like completely. They had no interest in it at all. And then some allowed the slaves to practice, use their medicine. And the root doctors and you know, um, the conjurers, they allowed it to happen. They didn't really, but I think after a while, like if it took too long, some of them reported that if it took too long, then they were like, enough of that, and um, they would get a doctor to come in.
Anybody in the room?
I can ask another question.
Yeah, please.
I'm curious, you spoke a little bit about enslaved people using voodoo, and I was wondering if you had a sense of what that would have looked like what exactly were people doing, and
Yeah.
was it actually voodoo, or was it just called that because it worked?
Yeah. So yeah, this was early on in my research. There was a lot of like practices that were like spells, chanting, a lot of like drumming, things like that were done. I think maybe I'm not too certain. I think potentially it would have gotten to them eventually, like, people getting sick, maybe they were using herbs that, you know, would make them sick, things like that. And after a while, potentially that's yeah. That was
Letitia, also, can you share with us some of you, like, I don't think everybody necessarily understands what all of us as scholars working on this and students working on this are faced with is not necessarily a dearth in the archive, but a difficulty getting at the enslaved people's perspectives in the archives. So
yeah.
can you talk to us about, give us a couple examples of what you're up against in terms of, because it seems like you're mining pseudoscientific medical treatises when the white doctor is saying, this is what I saw the enslaved people doing, and
Right.
probably has no knowledge of what they're actually doing or partial knowledge. And then what else are you digging into where you're excerpting those brilliant quotes for us? And what is that fight then to read against the grain from an archive that doesn't want to and was never designed to document what the enslaved people were experiencing from their perspectives?
Yeah. So I had to look into some account books. That was one way, because they sometimes would document the care for slaves. Some slave hospitals, they would have account books as well. It would be like names would be listed in there and what they were, what their illness was. But for the most part, I just had to rely on the narratives or interviews mostly to get just a piece of what was what was done, just to get their perspective, because mostly it wasn't. There was another book that I had to just like leave because there wasn't anything, they never documented anything that had anything to do with the slaves at all.
Yeah, now I'm thinking for Nova Scotia, because I've done work in Quebec and Nova Scotia, but in Quebec, we have this, I think in a way, a rather rare occurrence where the hospital that was set up by first the French and then taken over by the British in 1760 did not ban Black people. So it wasn't racially segregated. So one of the places, if you're studying Quebec, where you get information on things like this, is that you go to the records of the hospital, the Hôtel Dieu. But I'm wondering, do you even know if in Nova Scotia, is that the same case? Like, will you be able to, let's say, get records from the historical archive of whatever provincial hospital was set up by the British, and they were perhaps admitting enslaved and free Black people. Because I don't know how are you going to get at this information, or what are you dreaming up of as ways archivally to get at the same information for Nova Scotia, this is difficult work, right, for Canada. And just so everybody knows, this is uncharted terrain. What Letitia is doing is totally uncharted terrain, to be looking at this medical practice of enslaved people and recuperating that for 18th century, 19th century Black Canada.
Yeah. I'll have to find out. The first thing that I thought of was to do interviews, as many as I possibly can from some of our elders in the community. Outside of that, I honestly, that's a great idea. I might have to check in with those, but I don't know if they would have the information that I'm specifically looking for there.
I think the Nova Scotia Archive is your best friend right now.
Yeah, I think so too.
Because I think they're going to have some stuff. I really do.
I hope so.
But it might be like really bits and pieces. But the other thing too that I think is really important about your work that people might not fully understand, thank you for breaking down the histories of multiple migrations of Black people, right? So that enslaved people were there since the 1600s, and then here come the newly freed Black loyalists, and then here come the Jamaican Maroons. So in that too, Letitia, these are not the same quote unquote Black people. Blackness is different, right?
Yeah.
So can we get that some of those Black, who we are calling Black loyalists, who are out migrated by the British to the tune of 3,000 people, and there they are in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick at the time, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Some of them are African. Some of them were born in Africa who end up in Canada. Others were African American across different generations. Then here come the Jamaican Maroons, many of whom were also African born, who escaped within their lifetime into the mountains. And then some of them were African Jamaican. So like, what does that look like on the ground when they start to talk and share, right? And especially those who were born in Africa and Jamaican are like, where's the yucca? Where's the plantain? Where's the, like, they're confronted too with the difference climatically, right? Seasonally, of what doesn't grow here anymore. That thing I used to use back in Jamaica, that tree I knew, it doesn't exist in Nova Scotia, right? So then when they're all blending together, what does that become, right? And then eventually what it becomes is beautiful African Nova Scotia, that, right? But on the ground of that moment in the 18th century, what is that dynamic between them, even in those conversations of, hey, brother, you've been here longer than me. I'm having this cough in the like, what do you brew and drink? Because I don't got what I used to do, right? Yeah. I think that's a fact. But here's the thing too, Nova Scotia has, sadly, again, here we go through the white enslavers, has Wentworth, the governor's documentation of trying to settle the Jamaican Maroons. So all his letters to whoever he's writing to about that group of almost 600 people, we have those, but we don't have necessarily evidence directly from them, right? Those is how you're going to use that and how's that going to show up. Can you share with us a bit about who this next set of sitters will be?
Yeah, so the plan is to I'm connecting with my mother and trying to get her to just assist with, like, I know some we lost one of the elders who knew a lot and took my mother and one of my aunts foraging quite a bit to find chaga and everything. And so now it's just trying to find more people. There's a few that I know of that I'm excited to interview once I get back. Well, I don't know how much information they'll be able to provide, but whatever remedies or herbal remedies that they can provide, that'll be, yeah.
So a sitter for you in this next series is always paired with some type of herbal practice.
Yeah, I'll just be doing some interviews. So that there'll be other works, like the other individuals that I've highlighted, or the practitioners that I've highlighted, but then there will also be some of the African Nova Scotians, and some of the herbs that are local in the community, some of the herbs that would have been used would be a part of it as well, yeah.
Fantastic. So we'll go to V Sipes, who has a hand.
Hi, Letitia. Thank you so much for your work. It was excellent. And I'm so sorry if you did mention it, but I just have a question on, were there any herbs that you found in your research that weren't indigenous to, like, let's say in the States or in Canada, that the enslaved people used? So, um, just in your research, I was just curious.
Yeah, Mullen was one that I didn't know, but that was found in Africa. And I mean, we use it, I mean, I've used it back home. So I thought that was really interesting. Yeah, but Mullen was one, cotton. Those are some of the few that I didn't even know of.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Emily, are there any questions in the room?
There are.
Okay, great.
Go ahead, Diamond. Letitia, I really loved your presentation. I loved your paintings as well. They're very beautiful, and how you have woven artwork in the background as well. Of quilts. And one question I had is like something that like stood out to me in your presentation, which was the mention of healers and the different categories of healers. So you mentioned seer, the herbalist, and the midwife. Were those roles something that was brought through the transatlantic slave trade, or was that something that was created within the communities on the plantation in order to unify and to use these healing practices together despite what they were going through?
Yeah. So there would have been again, this is just, through a little bit of my research. The enslaved that were brought over, in the midst, there would have been medicine men, midwives, herbalists that would have been, and then it just kind of held on to their practice. Yeah. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. This was really fascinating to listen to. And I had a question about herbal practices and voodoo practices and their repression in the Americas. And you mentioned briefly that sometimes there were like records of enslaved people using like certain herbal practices to poison enslavers. And I also know that like voodoo practices were a big part of the Haitian Revolution. But I find it really interesting that like in medical discourses, these were just kind of like delegitimized and like discarded. Whereas in like the political realm, it was literally like banned, like there were laws against it. And I was wondering if you could speak more about what underscored so much of these anxieties about herbal and voodoo practice.
I think as like so they had they used herbs in a way that was perceived to be dangerous. So there was that. But I think there was also there was bits of documentation where people were saying like some of these slavers would mention that slaves don't need to know anything, they don't need to learn anything. So I think it was just trying to strip them of their culture, their roots completely, and limit their knowledge altogether, fortunately. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you'd seen any evidence of like the cycle of seasons and the weather impacting like access to herbal remedies, like if some would be unable to really grow or be found in the winter or anything like that.
Yeah, so there were bits and pieces of basically documentation of them in the slave narratives, I should say, that they would when it was a season for specific herbs, they would gather them and then dry them and then go through the process of preserving them and keep them. So I think they would take a lot of that into consideration.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, great. So if there's no other questions, we can conclude here. Letitia, thank you for a brilliant talk and so many insights Thanks to everyone in the room and everyone who joined us online. I'd like everybody to know we're going to be welcoming a brilliant new cohort in September. That's just around the corner, of course. So we're going to be scheduling a new slate of fall 2025 Fellows Talks. You can find the details in our quarterly newsletter. You can subscribe on slaverynorth.com at the bottom of the page. And we don't bombard you. We just send it 4 times a year. But we will have those Fellows Talks listed there. And they will also be hybrid in format. Okay. So thanks everyone for joining and hope to see you soon. Take care.